Good day, everyone, especially to you, sir. I am Nimorjanim Lahoy, and I'll be the reporter for today's topic, which I'll be discussing all about human impacts on water, particularly rivers, deliberate modification of rivers, and urbanization and its effects on river flows. Now, for you to have an overview for this topic, this actually starts with a consideration of the various ways in which humans have deliberately modified river systems by the creation of dams, reservoirs, embankments, and through channelization. It then considers how stream flows and lake levels have been transformed by land cover changes and how groundwater levels have been modified by water obstruction. The second part of this topic concentrates on changes in water quality, whether caused by pollution or by changes in river catchment conditions. And finally, there is a consideration of the ways in which our oceans and seas are being modified by pollution. Now let's begin the rivers. Considering how vital water is, humanity have tried a wide range of methods to manage water resources, and that's according to the words of Carpenter et al. Of year 2011. Also, because water is such an important part of so many natural and human systems, its quantity and quality have undergone major changes as a consequence of human activities. We can quote here to the words of Gleek that we must now acknowledge that many of our efforts to harness water have been inadequate or misdirected. Rivers, lakes, and groundwater aquifers are increasingly contaminated with biological and chemical waste. Vast numbers of people lack clean drinking water and rudimentary sanitation services. Millions of people die every year from water-related diseases such as malaria, typhoid, and cholera. Massive water developments have destroyed many of the world's most productive wetlands and other aquatic habitats. Now, let's dwell on to the deliberate modification of rivers. Although there are many ways in which humans influence water quantity and quality in rivers and streams, for example, by direct channel manipulation, modification of basin characteristics, urbanization, and pollution. The first of this is of particularly great importance. Indeed, there are a great variety of methods of direct channel manipulation, and many of them have a long history. Perhaps the most widespread of these is the construction of dams and reservoirs. The first recorded dam was constructed in Egypt some 5,000 years ago, but since that time the adoption of this technique has spread variously to improve agriculture, prevent floods, generate power, or to provide a reliable source of water. Some dams, impoundment dams, are of immense size, but others are much smaller, and the implication of these two types may be very different. Cumulatively, however, the presence of many small dams in an area may have a great effect on river flow and on sediment retention. There are actually 75,000 dams in the USA. Most are small, but the bulk of the storage of water is associated with a relatively limited number of structures. Those dams creating reservoirs of more than 1 by 10 raised to 6 acre feet account only for 3% of the total number of the structures, but they account for 63% of the total storage. In all, dams are capable of storing a volume of water almost equaling 1 year's runoff. and they store around 4 acre-feet of water per person. The decade of the 1960s saw the greatest spate of dam construction in American history, where 18,833 dams were built. Since the 1980s, however, there have been only relatively minor increases in storage. The dam building era is over, but the environmental effects remain and the physical integrity of many rivers has been damaged. Now, the construction of large dams increased markedly, especially between 1945 and the early 1970s. Engineers have now built more than 45,000 large dams around the world. Indeed, one of the most striking features of dams and reservoirs is that they have become increasingly large. Thus, in the 1930s, the Hoover or Boulder Dam in the USA, which has 221 meters high, was by the far tallest in the world, and it impounded the biggest reservoir, Lake Mead, which contained just under 38 billion cubic meter of water. By the 2000s, it was exceeded in height by at least 29 others, and four of these impounded reservoirs are Kariba, Bratsk, Nasser, and Volta, with more than 4 times the volume of Lake Mead. The massive new Three Gorges Dam in China is a major cause of current environmental concern, as is the damming of the Narmada River in India. Large dams are capable of causing almost total regulation of the streams they impound, but in general, the degree to which peak flows are reduced depends on the size of the dam and the impounded lake in relation to catchment characteristics. In Britain, table below shows peak flow reduction downstream from selected reservoirs that varies considerably, with some tendency for the greatest degree of reduction to occur in those catchments where the reservoirs cover the largest percentage of the area. We have the columns here for reservoirs, the column for percent of catchment inundated, and a column for percent of peak flow reduction. Okay, first on the list is the Avon Dartmoor, which has 1.38% of catchment inundated and 16% of peak flow reduction. Next is the Fernworth Dartmoor, 2.80% of catchment inundated and 28% of peak flow reduction. Next is the Meldon Dartmoor, 1.30% of catchment inundated and 9% of peak flow reduction. Next is the Vyrnwy Meadwells, which has 6.13% of catchment inundated and 69% of peak flow reduction. Next is the Sutton Bingham Somerset, which has 1.90% of catchment inundated and 35% of peak flow reduction. Next to it is the Blagdon Mendip, which has 6.84% of catchment inundated and 51% of peak flow reduction. Next is the Stocks Forest of Bowland, which has 3.70% of catchment inundated and 70% of peak flow reduction. Following is the Southern Uplands, which has 4.33% of catchment inundated and 56% of peak flow reduction. Next is the Camps Southern Uplands, which has 3.13% of catchment inundated and 41% of peak flow reduction. And the following reservoir has 2.72% of catchment inundated and 71% of peak flow reduction. Next to it has a 1.60% of catchment inundated and 42% of peak flow reduction. And lastly is the Chew Magna Mendips, which has 8.33% of catchment inundated and 73% of peak flow reduction. Across the country as a whole, the estimated reduction in median annual flood for large rivers averages 29%, for medium rivers 15%, and for small rivers 7%. The greatest reductions have taken place to the west of the Mississippi, and especially in the Great Plains, the deserts of the Southwest, and in northern California. When considering the magnitude of floods of different recurrence intervals before and after dam construction, it is clear that dams have much less effect on rare events of high magnitude, and this is according to Petz and Lewin of year 1979. Nonetheless, most dams achieve their aim, which is to regulate river discharge. They are also highly successful in fulfilling the needs of surrounding communities where millions of people depend upon it for survival, welfare, and employment. However, dams may have a whole series of environmental consequences that may or may not have been anticipated. Figure below is the generalized representation of the possible effects of dam constructions on human life and various components of the environment according to World Commission on Dams of year 2000. Well, as you can see, it starts from water and sediment and ends to humans. Now, to scrutinize it thoroughly, let's first with water and sediment to the dam, and right after the dam it has four effects, which are hydrological effects, pedological effects, geomorphic effects, and local climate effects. Now let's start with the hydrological effects. Here it is the occurrence of water chemistry altered, stream flow controlled, evaporation loss increased, the groundwater are being altered, and there's a change on water temperature. And from hydrological effects to fauna and flora, where the circumstances are flooding of habitats, effects on fish migration, changes in nutrient levels. Example given is lake eutrophication, transmission of fly, snail, and crustacean-borne organisms to humans. And you can see here that there's an arrow from hydrological effects to pedological effects. In pedological effects, the circumstances are salination and silt deprivation. Then to humans, there is also an arrow that from pedological effects, it goes to fauna and flora and to humans. Now, from the start, we have the water and sediment to the dam, and we're done with the hydrological effects and pedological effects. Now let's proceed to the geomorphic effects. Now here, the occurrence is concerned to the downstream degradation. There is a clear water erosion. Also, there is earthquake triggering. Next is coast erosion due to sediment load reduction, base level change above dam, and shoreline abrasion. And after that, that directs to humans. We can also perceive here in the figure that starting from geomorphic effects, there is an arrow towards the fauna and flora, and from fauna and flora, it directs to humans. Next is the local climate effects. Here, it is concerned to the wind, humidity, temperature, and precipitation. And from there, it goes to humans. And there is also an arrow going to fauna and flora and to humans. And lastly, we have here the world climate effects. It's just different because it is not under the dam, but instead it's under water and sediment, and this directs to humans. So, in general, everything starts to water and sediment and ends to humans. Several of these processes may in turn affect the viability of the scheme for which the dam was created. Some of these are dealt with in greater detail elsewhere in this volume, such as subsidence, earthquake triggering, the transmission and expansion in the range of organisms, inhibition of fish migration, the buildup of soil salinity, changes in groundwater levels creating slope instability, and water logging. Regulation of river flows may also affect aeolian landscapes by modifying sources of sediment and sand transport paths, as has happened on the Colorado River, according to Drought 2012. Sediment deposition in reservoirs, in turn, has various possible consequences, including a reduction in flood-deposited nutrients on fields, less nutrients for fish in the southeast Mediterranean Sea, accelerated erosion of the Nile Delta, and accelerated riverbed erosion since less sediment is available to cause bed aggradation. The last process is called clear water erosion. In turn, such channel incision may initiate headward erosion in tributaries and may cause the lowering of groundwater tables and the undermining of bridge piers and other structures downstream of the dam. On the other hand, in regions such as northern China, where modern dams trap silt, the incision of the river channel downstream may alleviate the strain on levees and lessen the expense of levee strengthening or heightening. Another direct means of river manipulation is channelization. This involves the construction of embankments, dikes, levees, and floodwalls to confine floodwaters, and improving the ability of channels to transmit floods by enlarging their capacity through strengthening, widening, deepening, or smoothing. Some of the great rivers of the world are now lined by extensive embankment systems, such as those that run for more than 1,000 kilometers alongside the Nile, 700 kilometers along the Hoang Ho, 1,400 kilometers by the Red River in Vietnam, and over 4,500 kilometers in the Mississippi Valley. Like dams, embankments, and related structures often fulfill their purpose, but they may also create some environmental problems and have some disadvantages. For example, they reduce natural storage for floodwaters, both by preventing water from spilling on too much of the floodplain and by stopping bank storage in cases where impermeable floodwalls are used. Likewise, the flow of water in tributaries may be constrained. In addition to this, embankments may occasionally exacerbate the flood problem they were designed to reduce by preventing floodwaters downstream of a breach from draining back into the channel once the peak has passed. Next is channel improvement. Is designed to improve water flow, may also have unforeseen or undesirable effects. For example, the more rapid movement of water along improved channel sections can aggravate flood peaks further downstream and cause excessive erosion. On the other hand, the lower reaches of a channelized system can see accumulation of the eroded sediment from the upper reaches, so that plugs of sediment accumulate. These sediment plugs can block channels and cause water and sediment to be forced onto the neighboring floodplain even at times of low flow, so creating swamp conditions along. In addition to this, lined channels may obstruct soil water movement, interflow, and shallow groundwater flow, and so cause surface saturation. The diversity of habitats in natural meandering channels means that straightening may lead to a reduction in the diversity of organisms. And this is according to the words of Garcia et al. Of year 2012. Channelization may also have miscellaneous effects on fauna through the increased velocities of water flow, reductions in the extent of shelter in the channel bed, and by reduced nutrient inputs due to the destruction of overhanging bank vegetation. In the case of large swamps, like those of the Sud in Sudan or the Okavango in Botswana, the channelization of rivers could completely transform the whole character of the swamp environment. Illustration below highlights the differences between the natural and artificial channels. In the natural channel, the suitable water temperatures has adequate shading, good cover for fish life, minimal variation in temperatures, abundant leaf material input. While on the artificial channel, there is an increase in water temperatures. There is no shading, no cover for fish life, and there is a rapid daily and seasonal fluctuations in temperatures and a reduced leaf material input. You can compare both channel that in the natural channel there is trees, there is plants, while on the other side when it is an artificial channel there are no trees. And in natural channel, sorted gravels provide diversified habitats for many stream organisms, while on the artificial channel it is an unsorted gravel. It reduces in habitats and it has few organisms. And here it is mostly riffle. Next is that on the pool environment, in the natural channel, when high flow, it has diversity of water velocities. It is high in pools, lower in riffles, resting areas abundant beneath undercut banks or behind large rocks, etc. And when it is low flow in natural channel, there is a sufficient water to support fish and other aquatic life during dry season. On contrary, in artificial channel, pool environment in high flow may have stream velocity higher than some aquatic life can withstand, few or no resting places, and during low flow it cannot support diversity of fish and aquatic life. Deliberate modification of a river regime can be achieved by long-distance interbasin water transfers. That's according to Shiklumanov of year 1985. Transfers necessitated by the unequal spatial distribution of water resources and by the increasing rates of water consumption. The total volume of water in the various transfer systems in operation and under construction on a global scale is about 300 cubic kilometers a year, with the largest countries in terms of volume of transfers being Canada, the former Soviet Union, the USA, and India. In future decades, it is likely that many even greater schemes will be constructed. Route lengths of some hundreds of kilometers will be common, and the water balances of many rivers and lakes will be transformed. When one turns to the coastal portions of rivers, to estuaries of another human impact, dredging can be as complex as the effects of dams and reservoirs upstream. Dredging and filling are certainly widespread and often desirable. Dredging may be performed to create and maintain canals, navigation channels, turning basins, harbors and marinas, to lay pipelines, and to obtain a source of material for fill or construction. Filling is the deposition of dredged materials to create new land. There are miscellaneous ecological effects of such actions. In the first place, filling directly disrupts habitats. Second, the generation of large quantities of suspended silt tends physically to smoother bottom-dwelling plants and animals. It tends to smoother fish by clogging their gills, reduces photosynthesis through the effects of turbidity, and tends to lead to eutrophication by an increased nutrient release. Likewise, the destruction of marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses by dredge and fill can result in the loss of these natural purifying systems. The removal of vegetation may also cause erosion. Moreover, as silt deposits stirred up by dredging accumulate elsewhere in the estuary, they tend to create a false bottom, characterized by shifting, unstable sediments. The dredged bottom, fill deposits, or spoil areas are slowly, if at all, recolonized by fauna and flora. Furthermore, dredging tends to change the configuration of currents, the rate of freshwater drainage, and may provide avenues for saltwater intrusion. Now, let's jump up to urbanization and its effects on river flows. The process of urbanization has a considerable hydrological impact in terms of controlling rates of erosion and the delivery of pollutants to rivers, and in terms of influencing the nature of runoff and other hydrological characteristics. Urbanization affects flood runoff. Research both in the USA and in Britain has shown that because urbanization produces extended impermeable surfaces of bitumen, tarmac, tiles, and concrete, there is a tendency for flood runoff to increase in comparison with rural sites. City drainage densities may be greater than those in natural conditions, and the installation of sewers and storm drains accelerates runoff. The greater the area that is underlain by sewers, the greater is the discharge for a particular recurrence level. The peak discharges are higher and occur sooner after runoff starts in basins that have been affected by urbanization and the installation of sewers. Some runoff may be generated in urban areas because low vegetation densities mean that evapotranspiration is limited. However, in many cases, the effect of urbanization is greater on small floods as the size of the flood and its recurrence interval increase. So the effect of urbanization diminishes. A probable explanation for this is that during a severe and prolonged storm event, a non-urbanized catchment may become so saturated and its channel network so extended that it begins to behave hydrologically as if it were an impervious catchment with a dense surface water drain network. Under these conditions, a rural catchment produces floods of a type and size similar to those of its urban counterpart. Moreover, a further mechanism probably operates in the same direction, for in an urban catchment, it seems probable that some throttling of flow occurs in surface water drains during intense storms, tending to attenuate the very highest discharges. Thus, Hall is believed, whilst the size of small frequent floods is increased many times by urbanization, large, rare floods, the ones likely to cause extreme damage, are not significantly affected by the construction of suburban areas within a catchment area. Hull's findings may not be universally applicable. For example, Wilson in 1967, working in Jackson, found that the 50-year flood for an urbanized catchment was 3 times higher than that of a rural one, and Shang and Wilson of year 2009, working in Los Angeles, found that both frequent and rare floods were sensitive to urbanization. A whole series of techniques have been developed in an attempt to reduce and delay urban storm runoff. Table below measures for reducing and delaying urban storm runoff, including various types of sustainable urban drainage systems. Here, we have an area for large flat roof, car parks, residential, and general. Under reducing runoff, for the area of large flat roof, we have the cistern storage, rooftop gardens, pool storage or fountain storage, and sod roof cover. Delaying runoff are ponding on roof by constricted drain pipes, increasing roof roughness. One is rippled roof, second is gravelled roof. For the area of car parks, under reducing runoff are porous pavement. One, gravel car parks. Second is porous or punctured asphalt. Next to it is concrete vaults and cisterns beneath car parks in high value areas, vegetated ponding areas around car parks, and gravel trenches. Under delaying runoff, grassy strips on car parks, grass waterways draining car parks, ponding and detention measures for impervious areas. Number 1, rippled pavement. Second, depressions. And third is basins. Next is we have an area for residential. Cisterns for individual homes or groups of homes. We have here gravel drives. Next is contoured landscape. Next is we have the groundwater recharge. One, perforated pipe. Second, gravel, which is sand. Third, trench. Fourth, porous pipe. 5, dry wells. And vegetated depressions. Under the delaying runoff, reservoir or detention basin, planting a high delaying grass, which is high of roughness, grassy gutters or channels, increased length of travel of runoff by means of gutters, diversions, and so on. And in the area of general, under reducing runoff are gravel alleys and porous pavements. And in delaying runoff, only gravel alleys. Now, the table above tackle urban surface runoff problems at source using features such as soakaways or infiltration basins. That's according to Brander et al. Of year 2004. Permeable pavements, grass swales or vegetated filter strips, infiltration trenches, ponds, which are detention and retention basins, and wetlands to attenuate flood peak flows. Okay, for further reading, if you wanted to enrich your knowledge on this topic and really wanted to know more about the human impacts on water, you can utilize the reference I put in the presentation. That's the end of my presentation, and thank you for listening.